my friends, we're back with another exciting episode of Infamous Federal Prisoners. You gotta hear this one. This is about Al Capone, one of the most famous and superstar gangsters in all of history, at least American history. So let me say this to begin with though. If you haven't subscribed, please just hit the subscribe button right now. It helps me and it helps this channel. And ultimately it's gonna help you because I'm gonna be able to bring more content like the content you're about to hear. So let's get into it. Alphonse Gabriel Capone. So he's born in New York City. His parents are immigrants, like many people were back then. This is it's 1899. I was going to say 1900, but it's not even 1900, it's 1899 when Capone is born. His parents are immigrants, poor, hardworking. They didn't have much, poverty-stricken, of course. Living in New York City, and I'm imagining that back at the turn of the century, things were probably not quite as comfortable as they are today. Probably dirt roads through the city, the buildings weren't built very well, probably a lot of them weren't anyway. Probably not a lot of law enforcement, a lot of crime. So Capone went ahead and he was a pretty good kid right up until about the 6th grade when he got into it with one of his teachers. His teacher struck him and he struck the teacher back and the teacher beat the shit out of him. So he never went back to school again. And soon thereafter, he went to Brooklyn to 5 Points and joined up with the gang, the 5 Points gang. And that's where there were other famous mobsters later to become famous mobsters like Lucky Luciano, Johnny Torrio were among those. Capone ended up working as a bouncer in one of the brothels. And that's where two things happened, more than likely. We know one thing happened for sure. He got into it with the guy because Capone insulted this guy's girlfriend. The dude took offense. He happened to have a knife. He got the better of Capone, and he ended up slicing his face a couple of times just to mark him. He wasn't trying to kill him. He was just trying to mark him. And as we all know, some people do occasionally just stab somebody in the butt just to get them off the yard or whatever, just to move them out of the way. Sometimes they'll use a razor in prison, slash their face a little bit. It happens. So he became known to others eventually as Scarface, Al Scarface Capone. The other thing that happened at the brothel where he was a bouncer is probably he was into it with some of the working women, some of the prostitutes that would have been present there. He contracted gonorrhea or syphilis. He contracted a venereal disease. He was never treated for it. Back then, they really didn't know any treatments. They didn't know about penicillin. They thought that if they induced malaria, that it would somehow help. And that happened later on while he was at Alcatraz or after Alcatraz, and it nearly killed him. So it wasn't a great deal for him. So he came up in the rough and tumble streets of Brooklyn, 5 Points. He was well known. He was liked. He was respected. Evidently, he did whatever he had to do and didn't make any complaints and step on anybody's toe. Now, in the meantime, Johnny Torrio went to Chicago and became a member of the Chicago outfit, called themselves the Outfit. Soon thereafter, Torrio wanted Al to come on out and join him in Chicago and become part of the outfit. Remember, this was when Prohibition was in its infancy. But even from its infancy, Prohibition was in its heyday because there was no way that American public was not going to stop drinking. They were not going to stop drinking for anything. Nobody cared about Prohibition, really, except the revenuers and government agents and stuff, fun busters, right? Who cared? But it gave mobsters all over the United States the opportunity to make large sums of money. It's estimated that at the height of business that Al Capone and the outfit were making $60 million a year. I don't know. Seems like a lot back then, but I guess it's possible. Now, When Torrio went to Chicago, he went to work for Big Jim Colosimo. In the mob, if you're the boss, you always have a target on your back. The people who are closest to you are most likely the people who are going to target you, who are going to try to kill you or kill you. They're very good at what they do. They're very good at rocking you to sleep, catching you when you're least expecting it or catching you in a blind spot and blasting you. Very good at it. Been very good, very successful at assassinations of bosses. Colosimo was operating hundreds of brothels in Chicago, and he had the gambling rackets. Of course, everybody wanted to be liquored up, so they had the bootlegging. It was just huge. It was bigger than big. The same year that Al Capone went out to Chicago, Big Jim Colosimo was murdered, assassinated. Whether Capone was responsible or an accomplice in that killing, who knows? Never been solved. So Colosimo's organization capitalized on everything, just took over the whole thing. But his leadership was pretty short as well. About 5 years after Capone went out there, Torrio was shot, injured by a rival gang, supposedly. Then he was sentenced to 9 months in prison for operating an illegal distillery. So Torrio resigned as the leader of the outfit, moved back to Italy, supposedly retired in New York City. So from 1925 through 1929, now think about this, only 4 short years, Capone was the #1 man in Chicago. He ran the outfit. And Capone was smart. He was smart. And he always covered his tracks very well. And he seemed to have some kind of an insight, a superior insight into the motives of those around him. So, he could pretty much read what was going on, who was who and what was what. But as it happened, there were also rival gangs. There was this gang called the Bugs Moran gang. I think mostly they were on the west side of Chicago, but they're always trying to take over new territory because that's what they do. On February 14th of 1929, there were a bunch of, there were 7 members of Bug Moran's gang that went to this garage. They were lured there, this automotive repair shop. When they got there, these fake police officers threw down on them, made them line up against the wall, and then these fake police officers machine gunned them to death, probably with Thompson submachine gun, 45 caliber. It came to be known as the St. Valentine's Massacre. The brutality of these murders, even for gangland, it was a bloodbath. It was all over the headlines all across the country. Capone just happened to be on vacation at his home in Miami. Obviously was behind that scene, put Bug Moran's gang back on its heels, got them out of that territory they were trying to take over. The feds, the Bureau of Investigation, was steadily trying to make a case on Capone, but they couldn't because, again, Capone was too clever. He was suave. He was sophisticated in the way that he dealt with people. Knowing Chicago, like I know Chicago, today, there's a lot of graft. There's a lot of corruption. He was probably lining the pockets of, not he himself, but some of his associates were directed to line the pockets of local police station captains and whomever had the inside information and power in those precincts. Most likely paid off. Probably paid pretty good. The Bureau of Investigation knew that Capone had a lot of money. He was getting it from somewhere. He wasn't living the lavish lifestyle that he was living without having some kind of serious income. They sent the U.S. Treasury Special Intelligence Unit after Capone. The Bureau of Investigation couldn't get anything on him. They couldn't make a case on him. Eventually, in 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years. I don't know, maybe it's the longest one that's ever been handed down. He served time in the Cook County Jail, and then he went to USP Atlanta. While he was at USP Atlanta, he kind of had the run of the place. He had a bunch of money, paid off a bunch of guards, he had his own room, he had it furnished pretty much the way he wanted it, had access to everything except he wasn't. But as circumstance would happen, Alcatraz, the federal prison had just opened. The notoriety, the Bureau of Prisons people knew that Capone was living large down in Atlanta. They decided to send him out to Alcatraz. So he went out there. Capone was a model prisoner, widely respected. The syphilis was kicking in. What it was doing was it was destroying his brain. He did participate. For example, he played the banjo in the prison band. Yeah, Al Capone playing banjo. Can you imagine going to a nightclub? Al Capone, he played the banjo. He was released in 1939 because of the syphilis, because of his medical condition. They said that he had the cognitive process of a 12-year-old child. In other words, that syphilis was eating up his brain at lightning speed. He went back to Florida with his wife, May. They married early and loyal to him. They had one child. And there he died in 1947 at the age of 48. To make a long story short, Al Capone didn't live long. He became infamous because of his abilities to become leader of the outfit in Chicago. And I think just the essence of who he was, what he looked like on his face, and being basically untouchable by the Bureau of Investigation, I think it kind of set him apart to him as a superstar gangster in the United States. But if you look at his life, I mean, for all of the money that he had, for all of the luxury he was able to afford, he died a very early death, had syphilis, probably didn't enjoy any of the last years of his life. Maybe he did. Maybe he just didn't know anything. Maybe he did have that childlike outlook or innocence. They said he did a lot of fishing down there. But the end of this story is that Capone died at the age of 48, was promptly buried, and never forgotten about because of the legend. Quite frankly, the legend often grows bigger than the man. He probably committed a lot of heinous deeds. Probably was responsible. They say he was probably responsible for 200 murders. They're just guesstimating because they can never pin him down on any one of them. But they say probably 200. Who knows? He was certainly guilty of many very serious, very violent crimes, most of them against other people that were in the mob, other gangsters. So really, law enforcement probably really didn't pay that much attention to it. But let me ask you this. If you haven't subscribed, will you now go ahead and subscribe to this channel and help me to bring you more content like this content? I'd really appreciate it if you would purchase one or more of my books if you haven't already. And I want to tell you, our next episode is going to be a really good one. Our next episode of Notorious Gangsters is going to be about John Dillinger, a name that's right up there with Al Capone for sure. See you then.